A type ABO man. "Is there any way I can get a cup of coffee with lots of sugar?" asked the homeless man who was sitting in the hospital waiting room. Still half asleep and just coming to work at B.B. Putney Memorial Hospital in Albany, Georgia, I waved my hand back and forth as if to tell him not to bother me right now. Entering the emergency room, I noticed Dr. McCall as he ran behind one of the many drawn blue curtains. Several nurses followed close behind very quickly. "What's the deal?" I asked the nurse sitting behind the nurse's station. "Car accident victim, I think," she replied, never looking up from the magazine that she was reading. I walked over to the curtain and slowly peeked inside. Ooh, that's bad, I thought, as I saw an older woman lying on an ambulance gurney, her right leg bent backwards beneath her body. "Kaiser, you go out front and watch for Mr. Chapney. He's flying in from Atlanta and should be here in about 30 minutes, said the head nurse as she quickly pointed her finger toward the front of the hospital. Walking toward the entrance, I once again had to venture through the emergency room waiting room. "Is there any chance I can get a cup of coffee with lots of sugar?" asked the dingy fellow again. Walking into the hospital gift shop, I poured a hot cup of coffee and dumped in about a half-pound of sugar. Waiting for Mr. Chapney to arrive, I constantly watched through the large glass window as I walked back to the waiting room and handed the coffee to the man. We knew Jeffrey very well. He constantly visited the hospital emergency room several times a week with one ailment or another. Just the week before, he had a real rectal itching problem, so we gave him a 4-pack of suppositories. Several hours later, he returned and told us that his problem had not been relieved. When the nurse asked him if he'd used one of the suppositories, he replied, "I used 2 of them, and they sure tasted waxy, too." It took everything Dr. McCall could do to keep from laughing. I stood outside for more than an hour waiting for the gentleman to arrive. All at once, a black Cadillac raced into the driveway and came to a screeching halt. A well-dressed man opened the back door of the limousine and headed toward me. "Chapney here, where's my wife?" shouted the large man in a very authoritative voice. As he pushed everyone to the side, I tried to explain to him that she was in the emergency room when I'd last seen her. When we reached the emergency room door, I carefully reached up and placed my hand onto his arm. "You wait here, and I'll see what's happening. No one's allowed inside except the hospital personnel," I told him. All at once, the man pushed me, causing me to fall against the wall. "Hey!" I yelled. "You can't go in there!" The gentleman stopped, gave me a very stern look, and then he pointed his finger directly at my nose. Backing up from his large finger in my face, I pointed to the seating area and said, "You sit down over there, and I'll let you know where your wife is, and I'll let you know as soon as you can see her." Slowly, the man turned and began walking away. "Jesus Christ, you stink like hell," he screamed at Jeffrey as he quickly moved away from him. Jeffrey smiled, reached into his shirt pocket, and pulled out the 2 remaining suppositories and said to the man, "Would you like a candy?" I smiled, and I walked back into the emergency room. Several minutes later, I walked back into the waiting room, and I explained to Mr. Chapney that the doctor was having a very difficult time finding blood for his wife, that his wife had a very unusual blood type. "I know. She has ABO blood type. Don't you fellows have any?" he asked, shaking his hands in front of him vigorously. "Excuse me," said Jeffrey as he interrupted our conversation. "Will you shut up?" screamed Chapney as he pointed directly at Jeffrey. Closing his mouth and looking down at the floor, Jeffrey moved backwards and took his seat in the corner of the room. The next thing I knew, Dr. McCall's hand was resting on my shoulder. "Roger, let me have a minute here," he told me. I walked several paces away and stopped. He explained to Mr. Chapney that his wife was in need of blood and that none was available. The nearest ABO blood that we were able to locate was in Jacksonville, Florida, and that it would take at least several hours for it to arrive. "Do you have some more coffee with sugar?" Jeffrey asked me. I walked over, took his cup, and I started to turn and walk away. "I have ABO blood in my veins," he mumbled. I winked at him jokingly, and then walked away to go get his coffee. Upon returning, I saw Mr. Chapney bent over with his head and arms resting on the water fountain. Saying not a word, I walked over to Jeffrey, and I handed him his coffee. "Really, I have ABO blood," he replied once again. Still saying nothing, I walked back into the emergency room and over to Dr. McCall. "What are we going to do?" I asked him. "We need that blood, and we need it quick," he replied. "Doc, that leg looked pretty bad when I saw it," I voiced. "That leg's going to be okay. The surgeon's on his way in. It's the blood loss that I'm concerned about. Well, this may be nothing, but that Jeffrey fellow out there in the waiting room says he has an ABO blood type. Dr. McCall, with a strange look on his face, turned and walked toward the waiting room. Within seconds, he had Jeffrey by the arm and was walking him into the ER. The laboratory technician was summoned and performed several blood tests on Jeffrey. Sure enough, it was found that dirty, old, homeless Jeffrey had a very rare blood type classified as ABO. I immediately walked back to the waiting room and I told Mr. Chapney of the news. Dr. McCall and Jeffrey were walking out of the ER when Chapney yelled out, "I'll buy all the blood you'll sell me." "My blood's not for sale," Jeffrey told him in a very firm voice. Chapney's eyes immediately enlarged to the size of golf balls, and he just stood there speechless. I watched as McCall and Jeffrey disappeared down the long hallway towards the Pennington ambulance section. "You wait here and I'll have a talk with him," I told Mr. Chapney. I walked into the gift shop, poured myself a cup of coffee, and then I headed down the hallway to find Dr. McCall. After searching for about 10 minutes, I located the both of them in the doctor's lounge. Jeffrey was in the shower covered from head to toe with surgical soap, and Dr. McCall was scrubbing him with what appeared to be a large toilet brush. I stood there looking at Jeffrey's dirty, skinny, naked body, his ribs almost protruding through his sides, wondering the entire time how such a body could have something more valuable than gold flowing through its veins. "Are you going to let that woman die?" I asked him. "Well, of course not." "But you said your blood's not for sale." "It's not for sale," he replied. Dr. McCall smiled at me, and then he patted Jeffrey on his back several times. Soap splattered everywhere. Within the hour, the surgeon had arrived, and the woman and Jeffrey were taken into surgery. Several hours later, Jeffrey was once again sitting in the waiting room along with Mr. Chapney. Both were laughing with one another and drinking coffee together. Later that afternoon, Junior Wilbur and I, the other two EMTs, took Mrs. Chapney by ambulance to the airport and loaded her onto a private jet. I was standing on the runway smoking a cigarette when I saw the long black Cadillac drive out onto the tarmac. As the door opened, I watched Mr. Chapney and Jeffrey emerge from the vehicle. I smiled as I looked at Jeffrey. It was the first time in my life I'd ever seen him clean and all dressed up. "Look at me," said Jeffrey with tears in his eyes. "The tie looks good, Mr. Jeffrey," I said, nodding my head forward. "Would you like a candy?" he asked me as he reached toward his shirt pocket. "No, thank you, sir," I said with a smile, as I watched the two of them board the jet.